Welcome back to Sunbird Garage. This will be episode 2. Check out my filthy, dirty garage. So yeah, I gotta get out here and clean this place. It's pretty rough, but I really don't have a whole lot of room in here with 2 cars and one of them being a project. So, but yeah, it needs to be cleaned. So on this episode, I'm gonna talk about some patchwork that I did to the car before I got it on the rotisserie, and you'll see a lot of the small things that I had to do, a lot of the big things I had to do, but I thought it came out pretty good. It's a learning process. I learned a lot on this project over the last several years, and I still have a lot more to learn, obviously, but it's coming along pretty well, so enjoy. This is the Miller welder that I use. We actually picked this up used from a guy that was a professional welder. He upgraded to something a little bit bigger and didn't need this anymore, and I'll tell you what, it works fantastic. I should probably keep it a little cleaner, but it works great. And I only have one glove because I weld like Michael Jackson. I use my bare hand on the gun, the wand, whatever you call it, but just for better feel. That's just my preference. I probably shouldn't do that, but that's what I do. I guess I should start and say I've never done this before. I've never disassembled an entire car and rebuilt it from the ground up. I have no idea if I can do this, but I'm gonna try. I'm gonna do my best. I'm looking at this project as a huge challenge to myself. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm gonna learn as I go, and I'm gonna surely make mistakes as I go along, but that's the fun of the project, I guess, right? I had a 1976 Pontiac Sunbird when I was in high school. My father and I picked it up at an auction for, I think it was $50 at the time, and this car was a complete rot box, and it was only 10, 12 years old at the time. But we brought that car home. My brother and I cut the floors out of it, re-welded floors in it. It was an original V6 car, but the motor was completely gone in it. So we pulled that V6 out and we dropped a 327 into the car. And that was my high school car until I graduated in 1991. But that was really the last time I did any kind of major car projects with welding and fabrication and motor work and all that fun stuff. So here I am 25 years later tackling not a small project, but a pretty massive project based on what you can see here. So the first project I decided to tackle were the holes that somebody cut into the B-pillars of the car, which allowed them to add speakers here. But I didn't want to just patch this over with a chunk of steel or sheet metal. I actually wanted to make this look like it was supposed to look. So what did we do? We went out and bought a 1980 Monza to use as a donor car. I actually picked this car up the day after I got the formula. It was over in Pennsylvania, I think about 4 hours from me. So I drove to Pennsylvania, loaded this sucker up, and drug it home for a parts car. And it actually donated quite a few parts to this project. First being these B-pillar patches. The patches were cut out of the blue donor Monza. I cut the holes a little bit larger in the formula. I then took this opportunity to go ahead and paint inside here with some Rust-Oleum paint just to seal it up. And then it was time for my first welds in probably 25 years. They certainly weren't pretty, but again, this was a learning process. This whole project really is a learning process for myself. And for my first try in 25 plus years, I thought they came out alright. Now, I did use a grinder to clean them up, and at the end of the day, these will be covered up by the interior side panels that go inside the car here. The next area I worked on was in the hatch floor. There were a few pinholes here and there that needed to be addressed, so I started cutting some pieces out. Started with a small opening here, but kind of quickly realized that I needed a larger patch. Looking in from the rear of the car, this is where the bumper shock would be mounted. You can see how much dirt and debris was inside these channels. So I'm not really sure what you would call these channels. I guess you can call them frame rails. They're not really frame rails, it's a unibody car, but they were full of dirt and nuts. So I cleaned all that out and then painted inside here with more Rust-Oleum paint to protect it. So fortunately the blue donor Monza's floor was actually in really good shape. There was no rot back here in the hatch. So I cut out a pretty large patch piece here and cut it to fit the formula's floor. At this point my welding had gotten somewhat better. It's not great, but somewhat better. And again, this is going to be all covered with carpet and floor mats and whatnot, so you're not going to really see it. And it actually turned out really nice when I was done. My buddy Bill gave me this angle grinder to use on the project, and to be honest with you, This thing was great. It really helped knock those welds down and pretty things up. So I've got to thank Bill for that tool. It really helped this project come along. Once I had this patch in, the welds ground down, I actually went and got a small handheld sandblaster. And I used that handheld sandblaster to blast the inside of the hatch, the tail panel where the taillights bolt in, everything. Cleaned it all up really well. Of course, it made a hell of a mess in my garage, which I'm still cleaning up to this day, 5 years later. Here's just a quick look at the underside of the car where one of the patches was welded in. You can see how rusty the car was underneath here, and as opposed to the clean spot where the patch is. But after lots of sanding and blasting and cleaning, the hatch floor came out pretty nice. Put a light skim coat of filler here and then went ahead and sprayed it with some primer. And it really came out good. I was really impressed with how well it came out. It's these small victories that really help push you forward on a project like this. You gotta do it in little bites, one piece at a time. Now that I've got some victories under my belt, it was time to turn my attention to the engine compartment. There were quite a few areas here that needed some work. We've got the firewall where the clutch pedal was, which is cracked and broken, that needs replaced. The firewall where the blower motor attached, that had a number of holes. Mice had lived in there for years and rotted that out, so that needed some patching. And then the third big area in the engine compartment was where the battery tray was in the car. This was pretty well rotted out as well. Doesn't look so bad in this picture, but trust me, it was pretty bad. I got out my handheld sandblaster and went to work on the engine compartment. This took a lot of time. This little sandblaster could only do so much work, and my compressor really couldn't keep up with the blasting duties required here. I want to say it took me about a week to get this thing completely blasted in the engine compartment, to the point that I could start actually doing some patching and welding in here. The first patch I went after was the battery tray area, and you're like, okay, how do you patch that? The whole thing is rotten and needs to be replaced. Well, I was lucky enough to find an NOS one on eBay. Well, it was an NOS one for a Monza, which is pretty close to the Sunbird. It was a little bit different. It wasn't an exact fit, but it worked good enough. At this point, my welding was getting decent for me, and welded that thing in there, went back through the spot weld spots where I had drilled it out and welded it back in, and it fit really well. I was really happy with this repair. Next was the firewall where the blower motor was attached. This had part of the blower motor hole completely gone on the bottom part of it. There were some holes over in the side of the firewall there, and a few holes under another one of the openings in the firewall. I trimmed out as much of the rot that I could, and then started coming up with a plan as to how I'm going to patch this. So the lower part of the blower motor hole, that actually was cut from the blue donor Monza once again, and I grafted that into the firewall to make that repair. And then I was like, well, do I make a bunch of little patches to fix all these little holes here, or what? And what I decided to do is make one large patch. So once that large patch was welded into place, I went from the inside of the car and cut those holes back into the panel. And that seemed to work pretty well. You know, again, my welds aren't perfect, but most of this gets covered by the blower motor housing that goes here, assuming that's what I use instead of going back with like a vintage air or something like that, which I might do. I don't know yet. The next big project was going to be this cracked firewall where the clutch cable attached. I was pretty concerned about how to repair this section. It was cracked pretty well. You really couldn't, it wasn't an easy spot to patch or cut a hole out of and graft back in. But once again, the blue donor Monza gave up some parts to save the formula. So I cut this panel out of the blue donor Monza and worked to clean it up to splice back in here. There was some cutting and grafting back in, but the large heavier plate, I actually welded that right over top of the existing plate that was there. That part was fine for the most part, except for where it was cracked around the clutch cable hole. But this patch seemed to work really well. I ground down the welds as best I could, used a little skim coat of filler in there, and then went ahead and primered it, and it came out really well. I was really happy with how this came out at the end of the day. So that was all the major work in the engine compartment. It was in pretty good shape at this point, and it was time to start looking at other projects to do on the car. Next on my list was the A-pillar, and this repair really scared me. But it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. It really wasn't. I took a cut-off wheel and just cut through the skin on the outside of the car,
down to what looked like a structural piece on the car. And once I removed that, I could see that the main structure was actually intact. It wasn't damaged, it wasn't destroyed, wasn't mangled. Had one little corner that was bent over, but we just used a hammer and dolly and brought that back in line. And then I just cleaned it up and sprayed it with some rust-through primer to keep it protected. Now that I knew how that was attached, I went out to the blue donor Monza and sliced a chunk off of it for the repair. I cut this patch just a little bit short. My gaps were a little wide, but I was able to fill them with weld. Took a lot of, tack here, tack there, tack here, tack there to get it to fill in, but I got it to fill in pretty well. And then I just put a little coat of primer on it just to protect it. But yeah, it came out pretty well. I was kind of impressed with how easy it was. It wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. This is one of those things that you work yourself up in your mind. You're like, this is going to be very, very difficult. This is going to be very, very challenging. And once you go at it, it really wasn't that difficult. Just took a little thinking and a little slow welding, and if my welding skills were better, it probably would have come out better, but I'm pretty happy with how that actually came out. Okay, remember the air conditioning cold air intake inside the car that was rotted off? Yeah, that needed some work too. So I actually cut that original one out, and a buddy of mine sent me a chunk of a car that I was able to cut this piece out of and then splice it back in. So that worked out pretty well too. So once I got it in there, I coated the inside of it with Rust-Oleum again, and I seam sealed it so that it would be watertight. And then the final little patches here, I had a couple spots on the top of the cowl, I guess you could call it. They had a few pinholes in it, and I was able to actually weld those up without too much trouble. I was afraid that it would be, just blowing holes through it left and right, but I was able to get that cleaned up pretty well. This next area, I'm not really sure what you call it. I guess I'll call it the cowl. This is what holds the wiper motor arms, transmission they call it, and rain drops down through here, and then it drops down through the sides of the car and out the bottom of the car. But this area here had a number of small pinholes. It was pretty rusty in there. No major rot, surprisingly, but it was pretty crusty in there. I actually cut holes in the side of the car, a cowl panel, to reach in there and do some work, try to get it cleaned up. So I scrubbed it out, used some OSFO to try to neutralize the rust. And I tried welding up those holes, but it's such a thin sheet metal in there that I just kept on making the hole larger and larger. So I ended up patching a lot of it with fiberglass from the inside of the car, on the inside of the car, under the dash, and I used some POR 15 putty to help patch those holes from the outside of the car, and then I painted the entire thing with POR 15 for protection. And then I'll go ahead and paint over that with some other protective paint before it's all said and done. So that came out pretty good, but I will warn you, if you've never used POR, make sure you read the instructions, because it says if you get this on your skin, it won't come off. They're not kidding. If you get it on your skin, you're going to wear it for about a week before it wears off. So I learned the hard way. I got some on my skin, and it took about a week for it to come off. I was actually starting to really enjoy this project. Going out there and cutting out pieces and welding in patches and making repairs and seeing progress was really motivating. So the next step was to get the rotisserie. The rotisserie finally showed up at this point, and I was going to start to work on getting the rotisserie mounted to the car and get the rest of the suspension off the car. So that will be next time.
So what'd you think of episode 2? I don't know. Was it good? I don't know. Anyway, so episode 3, it will be me getting the Sunbird here on the rotisserie. And actually that wasn't that difficult of a process, but I'm glad I did it. That was probably one of the best investments I made on this project, besides for the dustless blasting, which I think will probably be episode 4. So hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.